and stuff.
Okay.
And I think we're live. Hi, everyone. All four people who are currently in. I am Sam Osterhout. I'm the executive producer at Lincoln Square, and we missed last week, Andra, and I was very tired, but I also this is one of the highlights of my week. So welcome, Andra Watkins, for such a time as this. If you don't subscribe, you really ought to. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I know you were exhausted last week. Y'all had a big day.
Yeah, we had our 10,000 paid subscriber sort of
Yeah.
celebration. By the time we got around to doing the celebration, we had like 11,500 or something. Like
hmm
it's it's been crazy. It's been a crazy Substack. How are you finding Substack?
Um, Substack has, I mean, they say they're not doing this, but they have radically suppressed the algorithm for pages like mine, the sizes
Mhm.
of mine. So I have virtually no growth anymore,
Mm.
no matter what I do. It feels like Facebook circa 2016. And since I've been through that before, I know where that's headed. Um, but it's great that certain accounts do find discovery and whatnot. I'm glad Lincoln Square is one of those. And I'm
Well,
always glad to be here.
yeah, and that to everyone watching, uh, Dennis Green and 95 others and 200 people watching right now, you got to go to, for such a time as this, to Andra's Substack, and I'll post to it in the write-up after this video, and subscribe. What you've been doing, Andra, has been so prescient and so spot on over the past 2 years.
Almost 2 years.
You've been writing about Project 2025 because when you read it, you recognized it. And
Yeah.
I think, over the next, during this conversation, I'd like to talk about, we're going to talk about Project Esther. We're going to talk about Project 2025. We just saw this meeting with the generals yesterday, which was wild. And I think the more that I read and watch, the crazier it becomes in my mind. But it's all been planned. It's all there. That was already in the works. So we'll talk about that. And we're going to talk about this guy, Kevin Roberts. He is our white Christian nationalist of the week. But first, I want to just kind of revisit and talk a little bit more about Andra Watkins, because like I said, when you first saw Project 2025, you recognized it. I just would love to hear more about your own experience growing up in white Christian nationalism and how you got out. So let's start there. What's your earliest experience with understanding what you were doing, and maybe set the background a little bit for your own experience?
So when my parents met and got married, my father was Baptist and my mother was Methodist. And neither one of them had been particularly religious. They each refused to join the other person's denomination and compromise. So they joined a Presbyterian church
Hmm.
in Tennessee, where I was born. And so I was christened in a liberalish Presbyterian church. As a small girl, I don't remember going to church that much. When we moved from Tennessee to South Carolina when I was 4, and my parents started looking for a church home. And they immediately glommed on to this Baptist church that was growing quite rapidly in our town because it had a school attached to it.
Hmm.
And in 1974, 1975, in the South, that was a very common strategy for recruiting people into churches, was to have these schools that were all white schools that were segregated. It was a way to counter desegregation in the civil rights movement.
Right.
And so, they offered discounts for tithing members of the church to send their children to those schools. So I was enrolled in that school in kindergarten. It was a white Christian nationalist church and school. I did not realize that as a child. So over the course of the time that I was there, my parents became a lot more religious and a lot more involved in the church. My father was a deacon. My father was a captain of a bus route. Both of my parents taught Sunday school classes at different times. My mother sang in the choir. I played the piano for, multiple choirs and groups and offertories, and had quite a profile in the church as a young person. But had no idea that what I was being steeped into and indoctrinated in was Christian nationalism. Our church was affiliated with the moral majority very early on. When Jerry Falwell Sr. bailed out the PTL club and had the whole Jim Baker scandal, my church pastor had a falling out with Jerry Falwell Sr. then. That was a few months before I was scheduled to start college at Liberty University. And I was told not to go to Liberty, but I went anyway for a year. So I spent that much time from kindergarten through my first year of college deep in this Baptist that did this kind of Christian nationalism. And so, I was fully indoctrinated in that. I learned that the United States was founded as a white Christian nation, that the founders intended for it to be a Christian nation, that we as Christians were supposed to follow God's law, which was the Bible, that if man made any law that violated God's law, we were supposed to disobey that law, and that God would accept that, and that we needed to make our secular laws match God's law. And that's really what the founders intended, that America was, ordained to be special because we were founded the way we were, and we protected the nation of Israel. And so that was all really important. We were taught that we could never compromise our beliefs with anyone. We couldn't give an inch because, the Bible was God's perfect law, and what God said was the law. And so compromising even an inch, devalued and insulted God's law, and we couldn't do that. We were taught from the pulpit the curse of Ham doctrine, which is what was used during the Civil War and lead up to the Civil War to justify enslaving people in the South. So we were taught that, certain peoples were cursed by God because of their skin color, because of the story from Noah. And, so we had very few peoples of color as members of our church. And if anyone joined, they left pretty quickly, because how can you deal with that kind of thing? So that's the kind of history I learned in the school. We used textbooks that were produced by Bob Jones University, which is also a very far-right Christian nationalist university in South Carolina. And I had no idea that I was indoctrinated in that. I was taught that I should, seek to serve God with my life, that having a career was not important as a woman, that it was important if I went to college to go to a Christian college so that I can meet my good Christian husband and learn some kind of job that could help him in his Christian service, when we got married. And I was supposed to have babies, as many babies as God gave me. Getting married young was important. So I did all that. I got married at 23 to my good Christian husband that I had only known for 6 months. And I had this list of things that I carried around in my Bible, and I still have it. It's written in big pink magic marker. The 10 things that I should be looking for in a husband, and to know when I would get married. And so I was like, I've got all that. So I don't, we don't need to get to know each other. I didn't even know how to date, because we were told we shouldn't even go on one date with a boy if we couldn't see ourselves married to him. So, imagine that when you go on a first date with somebody, your first date conversation, the first thing out of the gate is, how well do you know Jesus, and how strong of a Christian are you? Because I can't go any further with this and consider marrying you if you answer wrong. That's horrifying.
It's horrifying. Oh my God.
But that's how I was taught to behave. So I married this man at at the age of 23 that I really didn't know very well. And even before we got married, I started seeing signs that he had a temper, and he became very verbally abusive once we married. That was escalating over the course of our 4-year marriage into being, shoving me around, driving the car too fast and running red lights and screaming at me and calling me all kinds of names. And I mean, that was new for me. My parents had never behaved like that. So it was a completely different world for me. And all these arguments were about him wanting to go to seminary. And it was very difficult for me when I'm being called things that I'm not going to persecute your listeners or the people here with, but very adult words, very
Right.
bad adult words, constantly, that somehow I'm supposed to go to seminary. And, I mean, one of these episodes, we were on our way to church and he taught Sunday school, taught the young adult class. And we were on our way to church and he was screaming at me and running red lights and pulling my hair and calling me words you can imagine that are very bad adult words. And then gets to church and gives the most amazing Sunday school lesson on hypocrisy in the Christian life. And so I'm sitting there like, what has my life become? I followed all the tenets that I was told I was supposed to follow in my in this church, and I've still ended up here. And by a lot of accounts, depending on who I went to, they would tell me, well, you just need to work on your marriage and you just need to be a more submissive wife and you just
Right.
need
This
to
is
be
your
more
fault.
godly. This is your fault. Thankfully, we were attending a Baptist church where the pastor did not say that to me.
Wow.
He said, you need to leave him. And I, at the time in my life, I was 27, I needed a man's permission, a religious man's permission to get out of that situation. So I divorced him. And that was a lot of women, especially that talk about leaving Christian nationalism, have some event like that where, I've done everything that I was supposed to do and I've ended up in this horrible situation. And, it's shaken my confidence in everything that I've ever been taught. But I still, for several years, weaved around that world. And then when I was 31 or 32, I had it was just a conversation with my mom. I had become friends with some new women and I saw their interactions with their mothers, and they all had like a friendship, an adult relationship with their moms, and mine was still very childlike. And that's one of the things that Christian nationalism does to you, is it keeps you immature emotionally. It keeps you in this childlike manner. I joke that emotionally I was probably a 12-year-old. When I was 32 or 33, my
Right.
emotional reactions were very off kilter, and still sometimes can be, because of that. That's just a boundary that I never really learned how to control very well, because of that indoctrination and that suppression of maturity that happens when you're indoctrinated in this world. So I asked my mom if we could have a more adult relationship like the one I was seeing with my friends and their moms. And, our relationship had always been very codependent, even though I didn't know what that was.
Sure.
So her reaction to that was very bad, and she essentially never recovered from it. And that reaction really shook me out of this stupor, and I was like, I've had all these setbacks with what I've always been taught. What was I taught exactly, and what are some alternatives to what I've been taught? So I picked up some history books. I got interested in the Lewis and Clark expedition and read Undaunted Courage by Stephen Ambrose, which was a Pulitzer Prize winning book about that
Mhm.
expedition, and realized that all the history that I'd been taught was wrong.
Hmm.
I,
Wow.
I read through a whole bunch of history books from that era, from the founding of our country, and realized that everything that I had been taught about the founding of the United States was wrong. So that started me on a journey into other things, into science and whatever. And it took over a decade when you go on a journey like this, you'll be undoing it for the rest of your life. This is never something that will be finished. And, I realized that I had been indoctrinated into a white Christian nationalist group,
Yeah.
and that I had been a victim of that, of religious abuse. And so, I didn't want to talk about that at all anymore. I remember the day where I thought, I don't ever have to think about the rapture again. I mean, that was just in the news. It's supposed to happen, a few days ago. So
Yeah.
I don't have to ever have to think about that stuff again. I'm so relieved I can go on with my life. And then I picked up Project 2025, Mandate for Courage, or Mandate for Leadership, published by the Heritage Foundation, which is a far right think tank
Mhm.
in DC. And I started reading it in late 2023. And almost immediately, within the first 10 pages, I was seeing this language that I had been indoctrinated in as a child and a teenager in the
Wow.
pages of that document. And I'd even read some of the things out loud to my husband and say, how do you take this? And he wasn't taking any of it as Christo-fascist. He wasn't
Right.
processing any of it as religious, but it absolutely was. And so I persevered and read the whole document and decided I have to write about this, and launched a Substack on it early last year, where I talked about this document as a Christo-fascist manifesto to transform the United States from a democracy into a Christian nationalist theocracy. And I cited numerous examples of that kind of language. I decoded that language. I still do that sometimes, even though these days they're a lot more upfront about what they believe. They don't code it so much like they did even 6 months ago.
Nope.
So, that's how I arrived here. It was not an easy path, but
No.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad you're here too. And it strikes me that when you write a screenplay, you have to, especially because men have been screenplay writers for so long, that there's this sort of character and dialogue default, and you have to run
Mhm.
your script through this test. Are there scenes in which women get together and do not talk about men? Right. And it seems
Mhm.
like your entire life up to a certain point didn't pass that test, right? That your
No.
existence was meant to serve men and meant to sort of flitter around on the edges of men and serve that. And it was a denial of your own personhood.
And, one of the things that I say about all of these white Christian nationalist groups, and we've talked before about the different factions of Christian nationalism, um, is that, they set themselves up as gods.
Yeah.
Their interpretation of the Bible, they treat as God speaking through them. And so that's one hallmark for me. If you're going to a church where especially men are standing up saying, I am the voice of God, God is speaking through me, run away. That is it's a viation of the second commandment of the 10 commandments that they love so much. They love
They
those 10
love
commandments.
it. I think Lynette in the chat says, I think we could argue they even hurt white men. And I think this is true. This system doesn't, as a man, it's a sounds mortifying to me. Like,
It
why?
certainly does not teach men how to be men.
No.
The toxic masculinity, that image of manhood that you're seeing on that side is very much how they get taught. And men are always taught that doors should just fall open to them, that everything should be easy for them. So they also don't have the emotional maturity or the coping tools or the ability to even look inward. That's even discouraged, and evaluate their own feelings and thoughts, and say, some of these things that I'm feeling really aren't okay. They don't have the ability to self-reflect
Right.
and to onboard, the only tools that you're offered in that world to deal with anything are the Bible and prayer, and going to talk to some Christian nationalist who's going to beat you over the head with more Bible and more prayer. And if,
Right.
as a man or a woman in that world, if you cannot find relief from those things, then there's something wrong with you.
Right.
And
Eh,
so it doesn't help anybody
no.
be effective human beings, in my view.
To be effective or whole or complete,
Right.
and like I don't understand the rage of men like your first husband, but I do, you know, it's an impossible scenario for any human being to say I'm godlike and
Hmm.
everything needs to come naturally to me. But guess what? It just doesn't. That is not
Hmm.
how this world works.
Hmm.
Even for white men, it's
Hmm.
pretty good, like doors do open for white men, but we're not gods. And anybody who tells you that should be ashamed. It
Yeah.
means
I mean, they don't tell the men that they're gods, but one of the things that people
godly.
routinely ask me is, how do all these people accept the president? And it's because they've been indoctrinated in churches that are all run by little dictators.
Right.
You're never allowed to question authority in these congregations. You're never allowed to push back. If you push back once and they tell you you have a bad attitude or you need to be quiet and you don't, then they escalate, they punish you,
Right.
they embarrass you, they humiliate you, they take away things from you, they ostracize you. So, that makes both men and women broken
Yes.
in the sense of how they deal with people. And it's something that follows people for life. I am still learning how to read other people. I'm still learning how to be friends with people and make meaningful connections with people, because it's not something that I was taught in that world.
I think, to transition into Project 2025, and kind of the events of what's been happening, um, the this most terrifying thing is that all of these things, creating broken people, is being codified in Project 2025, and now since January, it's being implemented,
Yeah.
and very quickly, with people like Russell Vote. Do we say vote? I always get it wrong.
It's
Vote.
vote, I believe.
Thank you. You always correct me, and I will never, I will never get it right. Maybe it's
Yeah.
like my internal compass just saying "fuck that guy." I'm never going to say her name right. Sorry, but yesterday we had, like I said, Trump speaking to all the top military brass and declaring that our enemy was actually within. They didn't wear
It's
military.
us, Sam.
It's us, exactly, and it's us because we are not being good little Christians, right? We're not being godly, and we are not obeying,
Hmm.
and that's it, right? That's the play. So talk a little bit about. Did you get to hear any of those clips from him or Hegseth?
Yes. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how Project 2025 was coming through that language?
Okay. So we talked a bit earlier about what Project 2025 was and is. Um, it's a document that the Heritage Foundation started producing in 1979. And every 4 years, they'd produce another one. And when they had a conservative president, that president would implement so much of it. Reagan implemented of the first one about 60% of their policy positions. And it's a policy paper. It's
Sure.
not, these are the steps we're going to take to do things. It's just policies
Hmm.
that they publish publicly every 4 years. So every time they get some of their objectives met, they'd move the bar further to the right. So Project 2025 was their Hail Mary. The makeup of the United States is changing. the racial makeup and the demographic makeup of the United States is changing. And so these white men knew they had a very narrow window to arrest that. And so Project 2025 was their Hail Mary to create a Christo-fascist, a Christian nationalist theocracy. They worked with people like Viktor Orban in Hungary to put together this document. And so I read it and wrote about it all last year. It is a policy paper. So I reminded people all the time that they also had implementation manuals and documents that they'd already put together to pull out, because they wanted to make this transformation in 180 days from the inauguration. That's one reason why they've been so effective. I mean, they haven't completely implemented it in 180 days, but they've gotten really far.
Yep.
So, and that's one reason why, because they had all these secret implementation documents and executive orders already written and timelines and checklists and all these things ready to go. And so a lot of what I did was try to predict what was in those in my reporting. And my husband looked at me the other day and said, Andra, sometimes I thought that some of the things you were saying were probably pretty out there, and it's horrifying that sometimes you weren't out there enough.
Yeah.
And it's still, so one of the things that Project 2025 called for was using things like the Insurrection Act to deny rule of law and norms that have been established in this country so that the National Guard can be deployed and the military can be deployed on American soil. There were people who were in the last administration between the election and January 6th who were calling for the president to do that then. But we had sane people in the room who stopped that from happening. We don't have any sane people anywhere in this regime anymore.
Mm-mm.
So that means you get things like the spectacle we saw yesterday, which, was all about suppressing dissent and the enemy within and deploying the military in American cities to root out the regime's enemies, which is, anyone listening to this broadcast right now,
And
anyone who's open to questioning what they're doing.
I think that I want to hold on that point for a minute because, with the indictment of James Comey, there's been a kind of a quickening over the past couple of weeks since Charlie Kirk and Jimmy Kimmel and all of the things. We have now a shutdown. We have, which, by the way, do you remember how big a story the shutdown was 7 years ago, and the shutdown before? Huge. And now it's like, oh yeah, there's another government shutdown. Okay. But the thing is, it feels like we are now all suspects, everyone. And this should send chills down the spines of ICE agents, because they too are suspects. Nobody is innocent under this regime. Everyone is a suspect, and eventually, if they need to, they'll find the crime that you committed.
Well, Americans have been fortunate. White Americans, peoples of color have dealt with this the entire time this country has existed.
Yes.
Where you're victims of a predatory government, but white people really haven't experienced that.
Nope.
So, a lot of Americans just really don't understand what that means. Project Esther was the document that the Heritage Foundation published earlier this year to lay the groundwork for the president's recent executive order about Antifa.
Yeah.
So for those of you who don't know about Project Esther, it was a policy paper that laid out going after terrorist organizations as deemed terrorist by the administration. So, they singled out people who were Gaza protesters and pro-Palestinian people as that, as being
that was kind of
anti-Semitic.
the initial target of Esther, right?
But I said at the time, this is the roadmap to suppress all dissent as terrorism. And so if you read the executive order that was signed about Antifa, it's so vague that it basically annuls the First Amendment, and they can call anything that they want to say is dissent terrorism,
Yeah,
being anti-Christian. And
I
that
have.
can even mean saying Jesus Christ would not have done this
Right. Let
as
me
being anti-Christian.
read at least a partial list. Common threads animating this violent conduct targeted by the EO include anti-Americanism, which what? Anti-capitalism. You can't be an anti-capitalist. Anti-Christianity, support for the overthrow of the United States government, extremism on migration, and extremism is another objective or a subjective word, race and gender, and hostility towards those who hold traditional American views on family, religion, and morality. So like you said, all of that is vague, but to take that a step further, it's not just vague, it's subjective. And subjective means somebody has an opinion about what those words mean, and that's the opinion that will target you, right?
And the opinion is the white Christian nationalist opinion. And
That's
I said that repeatedly last year when I talked about their rules about pornography, when I talked about what they would do to the LGBTQ community, when I talked about the transgender community, all of that. It's white Christian nationalist interpretations of the Bible
yes,
that are going to determine what those subjective definitions actually mean.
yes, and
So,
and and also the certainty behind their subjective opinions, right? That no, this isn't an opinion. This is God's
no,
fact.
we're speaking this is God's word. And that's one of the things that I keep trying to get Americans to see. We let them frame the conversation. So instead of talking about abortion bans as a group of people forcing their religious beliefs on everyone, we talk about them as taking away a woman's body autonomy, taking away her reproductive freedoms. And it is those things, but it's also a group of people forcing their religious beliefs on everyone
Yeah.
and making religious laws. And our country has not been conditioned to talk about Christianity that way. Muslims can be called extremists all day long, but
Right.
Christians cannot. And I even did a study several months ago and published it about how since the 1860s, when the New York Times was founded, they have used terms like radicalized Islamicist or radicalized Muslim or Muslim extremist almost 4,000 times in their reporting, and almost 3,600 times since 9/11. They've used radicalized Christian or extremist Christian less than 100 times
Oh God.
since 2012.
And look at the outsized damage that the radicalized Christians are doing to this nation.
Right.
Right.
And, this is not an attack on Christianity. There are plenty of Christians who are not Christian nationalists. And a lot of Christians don't even understand what Christian nationalists are. And, Christian nationalists have a right to exist and they have a right to believe whatever they want to. But it's their insistence that they have a right to force their version of Christianity, their exact interpretation of the Bible and their religious beliefs on society that is problematic, because none of these factions believe the same thing about who's going to heaven. We're going to talk about Kevin Roberts in a minute, who's in a different faction of Christian nationalism than what I grew up in. So, they don't agree about any of that.
No.
So if they ever get enough power, they're going to have some kind of 30 years war or Northern Irish troubles to fight about whose version of Christianity is going to be forced on everyone. So it's vitally important that especially Christians understand what this faction is and what it means and push back against it.
Well, so let's then pivot. Do you have a couple minutes to talk about our good
I
friend
have as
Kevin?
much time as you want.
Excellent. I think we do have an 11 o'clock, so I will have to go before then.
Okay.
So Kevin Roberts, this gentleman, he is our white Christian nationalist of the week. I like these profiles because they're grounding and they tell us who's who. And who to look for and who to read and who to, be wary of. He has warned that this will be a revolution and it will be bloodless if the liberals or the Democrats allow it to be, which is
he said the left, which, to a man like Kevin Roberts is anyone who's not exactly lining up with him
right.
is the left. So you have to understand how these people talk and what they mean when they say things. And that's what he means when he says that. Anyone who's not exactly on his team is the left. So Kevin Roberts is the president of the Heritage Foundation. And I call him Kevin, if you resist, we will kill you, Roberts, because that's what I translated that statement as. And what makes yesterday so much more horrifying, because they were signaling that they would do this and call for this more than a year ago, and paving the way for it in statements like that. He participated in writing and sponsoring Project 2025. He wrote the foreword for Project 2025. So a lot of the things that I was freaking out about in the initial pages were his direct words and alliterations and language that he was using. Kevin Roberts is a very devout Catholic, and he has spoken at a number of events that are affiliated with the Catholic cult Opus Dei. I talked with Gareth Gore last night, who's the author of Opus. He'd be a fabulous interview for y'all.
Oh, yeah.
But, we talked about that faction of Christian nationalism, which is only Catholics are going to heaven. We have to have a grand crusade to make the whole world return to the true religion, which is Catholicism. We want to undo the Reformation. We absolutely want to undo the Enlightenment and make everybody return to the Catholic faith. And so he is very much, nobody knows if somebody is affiliated with Opus Dei. They're supposed to keep it secret, but he has talked openly about his admiration for Opus Dei priests and people who are in that movement. So it is thought that he is one of these people who is affiliated with this cult called Opus Dei. Now, in the version of Christian nationalism that I grew up in, which is Baptist, all Catholics were going to hell because their faith was wrong. It was a works-based faith and
Right.
not a salvation by grace through faith in Jesus Christ faith, according to what I was taught. So these people don't agree about who's going to heaven, and people like Kevin Roberts, if they affiliate with Opus Dei, would force everyone to be Catholic. That is the ultimate goal of this movement on earth. So, the dominionists on the Protestant side, I am convinced, copied a lot of the Opus Dei Catholicism into their Protestant version of this. So it's a very interesting, he's an interesting character. He's very in your face, very inappropriate a lot of the time. He's great friends with J.D. Vance. He published a book last year and J.D. Vance wrote the foreword for it. Then there was some blowback and they postponed the book for a bit. He has the ear of the administration. He's great good buddies with people like Russ Vought and Stephen Miller. So, he's a horrifying character to be this deeply embedded into the halls of power. But that's part of what Opus Dei for 100 years now has been working toward.
Ugh.
So, they Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas go to an Opus Dei affiliated Catholic church in Falls Church, Virginia. So, there are a lot of these people in government right now. It is critical that Americans understand that that's what's driving this anti-democratic destruction of our democracy, because they've decided that, the Great Commission that Jesus gave was not go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. It was go ye into all the world and force the gospel on every creature and force everyone to live by your interpretation of the Bible. And so they very much believe that, and they are doing everything they can to implement that.
Yeah, I have a couple of things, and then we'll wrap up. What a weak state of affairs to your religion is so weak that you have to coerce everyone into believing it.
I've talked about this a bunch, but I'll say it again. I was taught that faith was certainty. And really, the opposite of faith is certainty.
Right.
So when I came out of Christian nationalism, I had to undo all of that teaching about what faith is, and accept that we can believe whatever we want. We don't know what happens after we die. Nobody does. Anybody who tells you they do is selling you snake oil, because nobody can know. We can't know. So whatever we choose to believe about that is what speaks to us, what helps us cope with the fact that we're going to die. And I don't have a right to look at anybody else and say what speaks to me should speak to you, Sam.
Which seems just
you should
pretty obvious.
You should believe, but this is very much what they believe. They have no faith. It's not even enough to say that their faith is weak. They have no faith. They are practicing certainty.
Certainty, yeah.
Because they so cannot cope with not knowing what happens after this, that they must be certain about it. And that speaks to a lot of people who can't, a lot of people need those kinds of assurances to give themselves those things to cope with the unknown.
I want to give one last sort of plug for such a time as this and your work. I have friends who are writers, and a book comes out and it gets great reviews, and people are like, overnight, they've done this wonderful book and they just sprang forth. And they're like, are you kidding? I wrote 30,000 words and trimmed it to, or 30,000 pages. And this was not an overnight thing. And we talk about Trump, and what's happening right now is this, like, wow, how quickly this all went, because we're looking at January, but you've been looking at the past 100 years and more. This is not something that's just happened overnight. It's something that's
and this particular thing they've been working toward for almost 50 years.
Yes.
So, any of us thinking that we're going to undo it in the next election it's ridiculous.
That's right.
Hopefully we have one, but we're not going to undo this in the next election. This was designed to fundamentally change our government.
Yes.
They've been firing people for months. So their threats to fire a bunch more people, so what? They call for firing half the government in Project 2025 and replacing them with sycophants anyway.
Yes.
So that was just a straw man argument for them. They were going to do that anyway. That's part of what Project 2025 called for.
That's it. And every show we do, the chat is full of, okay, well, what do we do now? And I have to say this, and the very first thing you need to do is be educated, is understand what's really, really happening. It's not just about the generals yesterday. It's not just about this shutdown. It's not just about body autonomy. It's about all of those things. But that's my big plug for such a time as this. You start there. That is a thing you can do. You can't beat if you're playing football or basketball or something, you're not going to beat the other team unless you understand their strategy and you can counter it. You have to start there. It's great to protest, and we should, and we have to. It's great to call your congresspeople, and you have to, but you need to be educated so you know what to tell them when you call them, right? You need to know what you're protesting. And the first stop should be for such a time as this. Andra, I get so charged up at these conversations, but I'm grateful for you, and I really appreciate you doing this every week.
Well, I always have time for you, Sam. I always love being here. So, and I mean, it's despite we're always talking about crummy things, but it's always great to see you.
But it's illuminating. It really, really is. Yeah. Well, anyway, thank you everyone for all your comments. I've been keeping an eye on them. It's it's one of my favorite things, is seeing what everyone in the audience says. Stay tuned. We will be back next week. Oh, also, maybe in the chat or when I repost this conversation, if everyone in the audience, who should be our white Christian nationalist of the week next week? Who should we feature? I kind of love that little segment.
Yeah, Kevin Roberts did come from the last one we did. So
Yeah, exactly. That was an
do
audience.
suggest your favorite villain, and we'll talk
Yeah,
about them next time.
yeah, yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Andra, and I'll see you next week.
Okay, Sam. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.